Great. Well, I'll go ahead and start. And good morning. My name is Oscar Chavez, Assistant Director for the Sonoma County Department of Human Services. And for those of you that are from out of the state, in California, the Human Services departments are responsible for the care and shelter of people during times of evacuation. So our department deploys staff out to shelters and helps to set up and do assessments and making sure that people can get the services that they need. I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about vulnerable populations and low-income populations and immigrant populations, that they, in fact, for a very long time are experiencing a very slow-moving disaster vis-a-vis their circumstance or situation, the kind of a discrimination that they experience. But what disasters do across our country is that unveil a kind of gross inequality that exists in all of our communities. And I think that that's something that we have to really focus on. For Sonoma County, our fire was the largest in our county history. And while the fire did not discriminate, as it was said, the recovery process certainly did, depending on where you're situated, the kind of resources that you have, the kind of social capital that you have, determined how fast you could recover. We lost about 5,300 homes, lost over 126 businesses, and 24 lives were lost. As it was mentioned in a previous presentation, as in our case, most of them were seniors, vulnerable seniors. We had over 100,000 residents who were evacuated or displaced during the fires, and our own local damage is estimated between $7 and $13 billion. So given that there has been unequal sort of distribution of recovery, I think it's important to understand what are the kinds of policy implications in terms of what communities can do to mitigate the kind of long-term impacts that vulnerable populations have to deal with. So as it was mentioned in the video and previously, in our community, we have a large immigrant population. About 30% of our demographic is Latino. It is estimated that we have about 20,000 undocumented residents. And despite all of the infrastructure that we have, we experience a lot of vulnerabilities in our ability to address the needs of vulnerable populations. I'll start by saying that when it comes to communication, oftentimes government doesn't do a very good job in having good embedded structures of communication, nor do they have the kind of language accessibility that you think we would have, nor do we have the kind of trust that exists with other community-based organizations. So during a time of disaster, you have to think about how are you going to get information out in the most efficient way, in a way that could be understood and trusted in the community. So we had to figure a lot of those structures out. There was other dynamics that were happening in our community around that time. There's a lot of discussion around public charge, and a lot of our immigrant community who were actually eligible to receive CalFresh and some of these other services actually opted not to pursue accessing services for fear that it might impact their immigration status. So we had to do a lot of communication in terms of going out to the community, bringing in trusted partners who had a trusted reputation with the community to communicate that, in fact, that they were eligible and that we were not going to share that important data with anybody. There was also a lot of concern around immigration raids. This was 2017, and what we began to see is that a lot of our immigrant population, undocumented population, did actually not go and seek help at our shelters. They went to set up a camp at the coast where there was no resources, no support, and that was very problematic. So we very quickly had to figure out how to send people out to the camps at the coast to let people know that they were, in fact, eligible for services and that our shelters were safe for them to come in and receive care and support. We also sent a lot of resources to those camps to support vulnerable people who were displaced. One of our social justice partners, Susan Shaw, who you saw up here, recognizing that if you're undocumented, you cannot access resources through FEMA. And so you have to provide a Social Security number, and even a lot of the philanthropic partners initially required additional proof of documentation that became very challenging for people to come up with. So they worked through different philanthropies and created the UndocuFund, which was a fund specifically dedicated to serving the undocumented community. And to date, they have helped over 2,000 families with rental assistance, with supplies, with clothing, with furniture, to really help them get back on their feet. So that was a huge gap that was noted within our own disaster, that we don't have the safety net that is there to serve all residents impacted by the fire. We can only help certain residents. Many of our renters, somebody noted, or one of the ladies who was speaking noted, the high cost of rent. We have a really high cost burden for renters in Santa Rosa, Sonoma County. You often have multiple families who are living in one apartment. So if you are not the primary leaseholder and you lost your home, it became very difficult to prove that you actually lived in that residence, because oftentimes, they didn't allow to sublease. So you had a family who was not able to prove that they were impacted by the fires and could not access some of those services. Some of the challenges that the fires created for vulnerable populations was that it very quickly shot up the prices of housing and rents, and a lot of them have been displaced as a result of that. A lot of them have had to move to other communities. We also saw in our most recent homeless count a jump in our homeless number in Sonoma County, and we have about 26,000 people who are experiencing housing vulnerability, meaning that they're one paycheck or just are very housed. They call it precariously housed, and so that is a huge problem. Because of the businesses that were lost, we experienced a loss of employment. And keep in mind that a lot of our low-wage workers were impacted. Sonoma County, if you think about, we're seen as this place of fine wines and happy cows, but we're also, have a lot of tourism, hospitality, and retail, and these are not family-supporting wage jobs. So a lot of these families are living paycheck to paycheck. So if one of the members loses a job, they're in crisis, and they have to access a lot of the support systems. We also had a lot of people experience severe trauma as a result of the fires, and in fact, they're still feeling the impacts of the fires, not knowing whether or not they can ever move back into their communities, not knowing whether or not they can afford to stay in Sonoma County. And a lot of those renters did not have insurance, so they were either underinsured or didn't have the insurance. What this fire did for our community is seriously expose a lot of the vulnerabilities that we have in our structures, and has caused us to really think about what might we do different moving forward to ensure that we can actually create a community that not only provides greater opportunity for vulnerable populations, but that can mitigate the long-term impacts of trauma in the lives of individuals and in our families. But in order to do that, we really have to call into question the existing structures that we have in our community. We have to call into question the kind of embedded bias that is baked into our systems that results in disproportionality of outcome for low-income and vulnerable population. It really means that we have to reimagine a new kind of community that brings together different stakeholders to the table to be able to tackle these very complex and serious issues. After the fires, we had an opportunity to host a statewide conference called the California Economic Summit. And we decided with our partners that a major focus of this work had to focus on resiliency, and that to address the long-term impacts on immigrants, senior, vulnerable populations, that we had to deploy an equity lens, not just an equity lens as a standalone issue, but an equity lens throughout everything that we did, how we invested our dollars, how we deployed services in our community, how we worked across sectors. And so I want to show in the last 4 minutes a little video of the work that we did leading up to that conference that brought together cross-sector leaders to address these serious issues with the goal of building out the housing that we need. And the economists tell us that we need about 30,000 units of housing in Sonoma County just to be able to meet our need. But this is an example of the kind of positive things that can happen from a disaster in bringing people together and reimagining new ways of rebuilding communities. No doubt the fires have truly upended our community. It caused tremendous damage, devastation, unlike anything we've ever seen.
We found points of weakness, and we found gaps within our community. We found populations really exposed.
People obviously lost their homes, some people lost their lives, then there's invisible loss, lots of loss of incomes.
We want to be able to welcome folks not just as Sonoma County, but as this region of 5 counties that were taught a very severe lesson and use it as an opportunity to rise better.
As we are focusing on rebuilding, and if we do it by looking at it through an equity lens, we could actually provide greater mobility and economic opportunity for those that have been left out historically.
I also think this idea that we're all in this together. The housing agenda doesn't sit apart from the environmental agenda, from the economic development agenda, from the education agenda, and that these things are really interwoven.
We're getting out of our sectors, and the people who are working on natural resources are talking to the people who are thinking about housing, transportation, the economy, and our workforce. Innovating about how we can work together to rebuild and bounce back better.
All of our communities are struggling with the same issues. The other side of that coin is that every community is unique, and that we need to address those similar challenges throughout the state in unique and innovative ways.
And the truth is, the fires were a whole year ago, and a lot has happened since then. I think it is an amazing thing that the summit will be hosted in Santa Rosa and Sonoma, because it just sheds a spotlight on the continued work of this community.
For that reason, I'm excited that the summit is coming here to elevate the conversation linked to resiliency.
What I love about this summit, it's not top down, it's bottom up. The whole notion that regions rise together, that we're not selling down an economic vision from Sacramento, that we recognize the diverse economies that exist within the nation's largest state.
And different factors play in different regions. And so you have to do a dream index that applies to every single region of the state to understand the drivers of that erosion of the California dream, measure them, and then put together action plans that drive progress.
One of the values of this Elevate Rural is that our voices are very small. We are still rebuilding our economies from a transition from resource-based economies to something in the future. And it will take urban partnerships for us to be able to do that. We cannot do it alone.
We're actually thinking about how to partner together and reframe, but also just recognize more fulsomely the degree to which early childhood development actually accrues benefits to the economy and to the workforce. We haven't always had business at the table, and so this is a really, I think, momentous occasion.
The challenge is, it's not just about near-term recovery, it's about how do you create a resilient community. And what does that mean?
I think the investments that we made in building relationships between each other before the fire are really paying off now.
The importance of environmental stewardship, the importance of water preservation and water quality, and again, the importance of housing.
You can't even drive down the road and miss a house that's being constructed, or there's Sonoma Strong signs around.
It showed me that we have the capacity and the tenacity to really get things done when we mobilize around a very important issue.
It also showed us that jurisdiction doesn't matter. Whether you're talking about fires or summit priorities like workforce, housing, and water and resources, that nothing cares about the jurisdictions we place.
We came because there were neighbors in need, and we can't stop until we get the work done. That concludes my presentation.